Well, let's back up a moment and think how we got there. Today and next time is really a question of how do you get to September 1st, 1939? How did the world progress, or, well, collapse into that kind of conflagration yet again? The whole point of the ending of the First World War was to try to set up a condition internationally so that something similar could never happen again. And yet, within 2 decades, it was happening once again. Well, let's go back to Germany at the end of the First World War. October 1918. The country came close to a communist revolution. The Kaiser agrees to surrender terms. There's an armistice. The final terms aren't worked out until the following year, but they are very much to Germany's disadvantage. The communists are furious about all of this. They see an opportunity. Workers in Kiel and a variety of other places throughout the country begin a rebellion. Well, eventually, moderates managed to get the upper hand in the assembly. The armed forces and the police forces were able to get this under control. Fighting continues, though, and Germany is in a condition that is desperate. 500,000 Germans starved between November 1918 and the middle of the next year when the Treaty of Versailles is finally concluded. Here you see workers rioting. And the result of the Treaty of Versailles was the creation of the Weimar Republic, so named after the place where the agreements were settled, Weimar. It was a constitutional republic. It was imposed on Germany from the outside. It was not Germans themselves, in other words, who constructed this form of government. It was imposed by the Allied governments who defeated Germany. It lasted from 1919 until 1933, when Hitler was elected as chancellor. And so, in a sense, it always had a taint. It was born in defeat. It was something imposed on the country, not something the country actively chose. The very first act of the Constitutional Republic, the Weimar Republic, was to sign the Treaty of Versailles. And Germans almost uniformly saw that as a disaster, a treaty that was hugely unfair to Germany. You see here the Grand Hall of Versailles, where the treaty was being discussed, and it was presented as a great victory for the world that this treaty was signed. Peace had finally come, the First World War was over, and now we could go about rebuilding Europe on a ground that would guarantee that nothing like this would happen again. But in fact, it guaranteed that it would happen again. It was exactly the opposite of what people had hoped. Here were the terms of the treaty. Germany had to take responsibility for the war. Was that fair? Well, Germans certainly thought it was not. Who, actually, we talked about the origin of the First World War, who, if anyone, deserved blame for starting the war? Who deserved responsibility for that war? Maybe Serbia, or really the one Serb, Gavrilo Princip, who actually assassinated the Archduke. Any other candidates? Maybe the people in Austria who wanted the sharp terms of the ultimatum that Serbia, of course, was going to turn down.
The Habsburg Empire.
Okay, maybe the Habsburg Empire, therefore. After all, the emperor really allowed all that to happen. Anybody else? Yeah.
Kaiser Wilhelm did have a lot to do with it because he kind of tried to restore this market balance of power that was established and he almost worked to pursue a very
Okay.
that is kind of where they got the idea.
That's true. Kaiser Wilhelm was not blameless. He didn't actively want the war. On the other hand, you could argue that he was the one who disrupted the balance of power, a balance of power that had left Britain, the dominant European, the really dominant world power. And Germany was challenging Britain for supremacy by building up its military, by building up its rather industrial might. And so you could argue that, actually he was the one threatening to upset the balance, even if he didn't directly pull the button on this particular war at this particular time. In any event, the Allies did, therefore, have some justification for thinking Germany was to blame. But the Germans could easily point to other people and say, wait a minute, it wasn't us. We were just one of the dominoes in this whole series of events. And so it was complicated. One side was able to say, this is only fair. The other side was able to say, no, it's not fair at all. Germany had to surrender territory. The Rhineland, the highly industrial area right along the Rhine River, was demilitarized. The Tsar was actually given a mandate and would eventually be allowed to vote on whether it wanted to remain part of Germany. Alsace and Lorraine were taken away from Germany and given to France. There was eastern farmland and a corridor to Danzig, which was taken away from Germany and given to Poland. Germans lost all colonies. They had to pay reparations of 132 billion marks. Now, in today's currency, that would be about $500 billion. So So it was a vast sum for a country the size of, and with the might of Germany, even at its best, let alone Germany after the war, facing the devastation that it had faced. Germany had strict limits on the size of its army and navy and was permitted no air force at all. This is an indication of what happened. That orange area that you see on the left is the Rhineland. The yellow area behind it was Alsace and Lorraine. In the east, you see an area of the Danzig corridor and farmland, Silesia, Posen, West Prussia, all of which were given to Poland. And so Germany shrank significantly. That was pre-war Europe. You see a large Germany and a large Austria-Hungary. Here is post-war Europe. Germany much shrunken, and Austria-Hungary broken up into Austria-Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, and so on. Well, the war debts imposed a huge financial burden on Germany. It also fostered a sense of resentment against the Allied powers. Germans thought the terms of this treaty were unfair. Whether they were or not, the feeling inside Germany was very strong. So you can see this editorial cartoon in a German newspaper at the time. You see Germany there being led to execution by the leaders of the Allied powers. Really, faced with such massive debts, there was only one way out for the Weimar Republic: to print money. And that's what they began doing. Here is a graph of the hyperinflation that struck Germany in the early 1920s. You see things going from 1918 up by 1920, but then absolutely soaring in 1923. Here's another graph that illustrates the relationship between the money supply and the price level. But it's hard to understand this from a graph. Let's talk about the price of a loaf of bread. Okay? What does a loaf of bread cost now? Depends what kind of bread you're willing to settle for, but probably anywhere from 79 cents for a basic sort of sliced white loaf to, I don't know, what, $4.50 if you go to Whole Foods and want the fancy one? Something like that, maybe more, I don't know. I don't go to Whole Foods. But anyway, here's what it was in Germany. Before the war in 1914, a loaf of bread went for 13, well, I'll just call them cents, but you know, pfennigs. Anyway, by 1916, 19 cents. By 1918, at the end of the war, 22. Now that's already significant inflation. That's almost the price doubling in the 4 years of the First World War. So the war had a significant effect in this way. It doubled the cost of living virtually for the average German consumer. A year later, it was up to 26 cents. 1920, now it's up to a mark 20. Then the next year, a mark 35. Then by 1922, it's up to 3.50. Well, go back to 1914. In 8 years, the price has gone up dramatically. But that's nothing. Look what happens in 1923. In January, the price of a loaf of bread is 700 marks. By June, it's 1,200 marks. September, 2 million marks. October, 670 million marks. November 1st, it is 3 billion marks. The cost of November 15th, 100 billion marks. Now think about it. Okay, a year before, it was going for 350. Now it's 100 billion. Okay, imagine that. Today, let's say, you could go into the store and buy a fancy loaf of bread for $3.50. Imagine a year from now, it's going to cost you $100 billion. That's what happened to Germany in 1923. Here is a 50 million mark note from September 1st. Okay, by November, this was essentially worthless. This wouldn't buy you anything. And yet, before the war, even after the war, at the end of the war, this would have made you a very wealthy person. Here is a 100 billion mark note. That would buy you a loaf of bread. Here you see that it got difficult to print money fast enough. They at some point just started stamping money. Here, a 1,000 mark note becomes a billion mark note. Just stamp it in red. Well, it became a problem. How do you actually get enough money together to go to the store? Here, where do you put all this money? I mean, the amount of cash you have to do anything is vast because each individual bill is worth so little. Here you see a woman who has hollowed out this post and is using it as her own private storage. Basically, you had to have a closet just filled with money to do anything. Here is somebody hauling money to the store. Okay, you took wheelbarrows worth of money to go and get bread or anything else. Here you see children playing with blocks made out of money. Okay, it was cheaper to just take the old currency that was good 2 weeks ago, but is now essentially worthless, and package it up and let them use it as building blocks, because it's really good for nothing else. There they are, with all these stacks of money. You might think these kids are mafiosis, involved in the drug trade? No! This was just now worthless. Here you see a variety of people doing this, making kites out of money in the upper left-hand corner, using it for wallpaper in the lower left-hand corner. On the right there, using it actually to just, well, I don't know what they're doing. Here you see people going shopping, having huge baskets of cash, bushel baskets. Here are kids building a huge tower of cash, and so forth. Here you see a woman lighting her stove with cash. It was cheaper than fuel. Should I buy wood? It's cheaper just to use the money to burn. Well, I guess that's the advantage. She had money to burn. Here you see people sweeping money off the streets. It was so worthless nobody would bend down to pick it up. And here is a woman showing the effects of all this. Her sign says, "Hello, I seek work." And then she lists her qualifications and experience. Well, what does this do to society? What happens when something that used to cost $3.50 now costs 700 marks, 1,200 marks, 1,000,000 marks, 1,000,000,000 marks, and then 100 billion marks, all within the span of a year? What does that do to a society?
You stop using the monetary system and go back to the simple trade.
Well, okay, good. After a while, money essentially becomes worthless. So you start bartering, you start simply trading. I mean, forget the money. The money I hand you now within an hour is going to be worth crap, right? So better that we just trade. I have something you want, you have something I want, let's just barter. Now, barter is hugely inefficient compared to having money that provides a universal standard of exchange, but still people are going to start abandoning money and just going back to barter. What else will it mean? Yeah.
Those countries will hire exports, so you can't pay your this.
Good, it will devastate international trade. Absolutely right. Basically, no one else will accept your cash for their payment. Well, I send you dollars in exchange for these marks. Tomorrow, my dollars will still be worth something to you, but tomorrow, your marks will be worthless to me. What else? I want you to think about what it would be like to be a German of my age, let's say, who has been saving his entire life, finally gets to the point where he has saved 1,000,000 marks, and he thinks I'm rich. And then a month later, it's like, oh crap, I can barely buy a loaf of bread with much less savings. Okay? That's what happened. It devastated the German middle class because it essentially made all savings worthless. It is true that interest rates soared, that people tried to do things to compensate, but the fact was that the banking system, savings essentially became worthless, the banking system shut down. So all savings, pensions became worthless. You retire, you say, but it's no problem, I get 1,000 marks a month. Well, next month, that's not worth anything. And so people were in desperate condition. Most wealth that people had, unless it was intangible assets, became utterly worthless. It wasn't just the wealth, though. The virtues that went into producing that wealth, thrift, prudence, hard work, all of those became devalued. People thought, I was a chump. I worked hard for 40 years on the job. Finally, I retired with that pension and these savings, and now they're worth nothing. 40 years of my life gone. Why did I do it? And so it wasn't just the middle class wealth that disappeared, middle class morality disappeared. A morality that emphasized hard work, savings, prudence, caution, all of that was punished. Now, in material terms, it was worse than that. Tons of people were thrown out of work, thousands became homeless, debtors benefited in the sense that if I had just borrowed a huge amount of money, hey, you want it back? No problem today, right? I just traded a loaf of bread for enough to pay off my house. There was an emphasis, therefore, on consumption and hoarding. Better spend the money right now while you've got it, because tomorrow it won't be worth much of anything. And so, indeed, people started demanding to be paid twice a day, because if they were paid for their morning's work at lunch, by evening, that money wouldn't be worth much of anything. So you had to work, let's say, take your lunch hour, rush out and buy things with that money before it became worthless. And then you work for the afternoon, get paid again, rush out and buy things as quickly as you could, because by the next day it wouldn't be worth anything. So there was a destruction of investment. The government found it couldn't collect taxes fast enough. By the time it collected the taxes, basically it was easy enough. Oh, on last year's income, I owe you 1,000 marks. Hey, here's a piece of dough. That'll pay for it. And so nobody was able to borrow, including the German government. Well, The Weimar Republic realized this was utterly unsustainable, and so the reaction was to just bring in a new currency. They did manage to stabilize the economy. They essentially said, do-over. We're beginning over now, there's a new mark, we're going to change things. And this is where the Dawes plan that we talked about kicked in, of the Allies loaning Germany the money to pay them back. And so for a while, that actually worked. In fact, it produced a golden age in the Weimar Republic. In many ways, the economy recovered, not in all ways, but in some. And in literature, in science, in the arts, in philosophy, Germany became the leading place in the world. In literature, Bertolt Brecht, Thomas Mann, Franz Kafka, Hermann Hesse. In science, Werner Heisenberg, and the development of quantum mechanics. In the arts, the Bauhaus group, Paul Klee, Max Ernst, Vasily Kandinsky. In philosophy, Martin Heidegger, Edmund Husserl, Martin Buber. And the Berlin and Vienna circles, including my own teacher, Karl Hempel, and Kurt Gödel and Rudolf Carnap and Moritz Schlick and a variety of other great figures. In social theory, the Frankfurt School. In music, people like Weill, Berg, Schoenberg, Hindemith. Lots of the great composers of the early 20th century were all doing their work in the Weimar Republic. So in a way, this was a golden age, but it was also a highly vulnerable golden age. And it was in this context, in what was in many ways the most cultured, the most educated country in the world, that Hitler rose to power. Hitler himself was born in 1889. He died in 1945. He started out as an artist, and this is an example of one of his paintings. He sought admission to the art school in Vienna and did not get in. Occasionally people have thought in moral philosophy, ooh, if you could go back in time and assassinate Hitler, would you do it? Here's another alternative, admit him to the art school. Maybe he would not have been a frustrated artist who then went into politics. In any event, he very quickly affiliated himself with a party that was already in existence, the National Socialist Workers' Party. For short, the Nazis, but that's what Nazi stands for, National Socialist Workers' Party. And here was their platform in 1920 when Hitler joined the group. It was in part a racist and a nationalist party. They sought the unification of all Germans in a greater Germany, the abrogation of the Treaty of Versailles and the restoration to Germany of all those lands taken away by the Allies, a racial criterion of citizenship, and the elimination of immigration, the expulsion of immigrants who were then in Germany. It was partly an economic platform, the abolition of unearned incomes. In other words, interest, dividends, inheritances, and so on, all were to be abolished. Confiscation of all war profits, and so nationalization of military industries. In fact, nationalization and profit sharing in all heavy industries. Land reform, and then an expansion of old age, welfare, health care benefits. This was, after all, a socialist party, advocating a much stronger welfare state. And then there was a social and political part of the program, a national education program from the beginning of understanding, restrictions on the press, the prosecution of artists and writers whose work had a destructive influence, religious freedom, but only if compatible with the state, and the unlimited authority of a strong central power. This is, in many ways, exactly what Hitler sought to implement when he sought power. He first started in, notice, November 1923, at the worst part of that hyperinflation. He launched what has become known as the Munich beer hall putsch. That is to say, an attempted revolution that started in a beer hall in Munich. Well, he was quickly arrested along with the other leaders of this group and ended up going to jail. Here you see him being arrested, and here is an American newspaper article about this. Hitler tamed by prison. Released on parole, he is expected to return to Austria, and as it says, it is believed he will retire to private life and return to Austria, the country of his birth. Well, they are convinced this political organization is no longer to be feared. Now, why on earth did he transform into the monster he became? Guess what he did in prison? He read German philosophy. And he was in part deeply influenced by certain elements of it. He read Kant, for example, and he was deeply influenced by this idea in Kant, the Rechtsweg, the kingdom of ends. It's part of what inspired his Third Reich. Kant there talked in one sort of enigmatic paragraph about a systematic union of ends. It's precisely what Hitler sought to bring about. He read Hegel and thought of the state as expressing the spirit of the age, the state itself as being infallible. He read Nietzsche about not only relativism and historicism, but his idea of the blonde beast and nobility, noble morality based on strength. And then he read people like Nietzsche and Heidegger, who emphasize authenticity, being the person you really are, and freedom, consisting in just absence of all restraints. Well, I'm going to skip through some of the details of that. In any case, Hitler ends up saying, I am a socialist because it seems incomprehensible to me to maintain a machine with careful handling. Notice the machine metaphor, similar to, well, a variety of things we've seen earlier, but to downgrade the noblest representatives of labor, the people themselves. And in prison, he dictates a work, Mein Kampf, my struggle, my battle. Well, in that book, he says there are two great evils that he is going to combat, Judaism and communism. He says, crowds are irrational. The people are important, but on the other hand, they're fools. They are to be led and manipulated by a great leader, namely himself. The main focus of his analysis is not the class struggle, which is what Marx emphasized, but race struggle. He interprets all this in racial terms. The superior race must rule. And in the end, there must be a struggle for power. Those who won't fight don't deserve to live. And so here's how Churchill summarizes it. Man is a fighting animal. The nation, being a community of fighters, is a fighting unit. Well, we're basically out of time. So I will save the rest of this for next time, where we see how he sought to forge one mind and one will in Germany. Well, I've entitled today's section Paralysis, Aggression Unimpeded. We're going to be talking again about the rise of Hitler, but today I want to also talk about an important theme in literature that emerges in a story by Jorge Luis Borges, and that was written in 1940 as he's witnessing the outbreak of World War II. So I think there's an interesting connection between those ideas. But let's return to Hitler's rise. Hitler was imprisoned after the Munich Beer Hall Putsch in 1923. The putsch was launched right in the middle of that really, really extraordinary bit of hyperinflation in Germany. It looked like society was falling apart. It looked like the economy was falling apart. Hitler tried to take advantage of that, ended up in jail instead. But in jail, he read a lot of German philosophy, among other things, and he started dictating this long book to an associate of his, Mein Kampf. There are still many countries in the world where Mein Kampf is banned, where you cannot read it because of the ideas in it. In any case, here is what he's really striving for as a result of all that society should have one mind. It should have one will. To take abstract and general principles derived from a philosophy which is based on a solid foundation of truth, he writes, and transform them into a militant community whose members have the same political faith, a community which is precisely defined, rigidly organized, of one mind and one will. Such a transformation is the most important task of all. So there are a variety of things he's trying to do, implement a program that we were talking about last time, and we'll talk about a bit more of this the next time. But nevertheless, the key idea is really this idea of bringing society into a kind of alignment, where there's one mind, one will. It's as if society is all organized on the same principle, with the same goals, thinking the same types of thoughts. There's a term for this, which Hitler borrows from electrical engineering, actually, Gleichschaltung. Gleichschaltung means something like alignment, coordination, making things the same, bringing them into line. And in practice, the way he means it, it is thought control. Actually, the term has largely faded even for German electrical engineering, where it really means just getting the circuits aligned properly because of this association that it took on. But it's still sometimes used for systems of thought control, trying to enforce a certain sort of moral view, a certain sort of political view on society at large. And that's the key idea here, really trying to mold society into a single worldview, get everybody to share the same perspective on things. A systematic union of ends is what Kant would have called it, but Kant had in mind, I think, not that all society was to be like this. He was describing either a moral ideal, which in a sense he's borrowing from Aquinas' idea of the angels and how the angels get along together, or he's saying this is a sort of ideal circumstance where everybody respects everyone else. That is not at all what Hitler had in mind. He had in mind a situation where we bring about a systematic union of ends in society by forcing people to see things the same way. Forcing, of course, only in the extreme cases, Ideally, you do this through propaganda, you do this through social pressure, you do it in a variety of ways that don't involve physical force. But the idea really is to get everybody on the same page, everybody thinking about things the same way. So what would be some examples? In our society, we tend to have much more, I think, the Ortega y Gasset view, that actually you see things from different perspectives and you actually learn from those different perspectives. Our idea of politics is based more on Madison's idea, where these perspectives get sort of coalesced into factions, and then it's a question of getting the factions to balance one another. That is the opposite of Hitler's view. The idea isn't that you have different perspectives, that you somehow mold together into a larger understanding. It isn't that you have different worldviews that involve different factions, and then it's a question of balancing their power against each other. No, it's a question of getting everybody into agreement, everybody to see things the same way. So what are examples of ways you might do this? Yeah?
Propaganda.
Good. Propaganda is one of the main ones, okay? You put out views. It's something where you basically try to have posters in the modern day, advertisements of various kinds. You do things to try to promulgate a certain received, accepted view. And you try to get rid of other views. You, through propaganda, try to suggest that this is the right way to do things. You attack anybody who doesn't really fit that same mold. Yes? Good, you try to indoctrinate children and the youth. One of the first things Hitler did was take over the educational system and set up a system of youth groups. Something initially modeled on the Boy Scouts, but then as you got older, you would get into what was called the Hitler Youth. And it was a program of political indoctrination, among other things. It was really training people to be soldiers, but part of that was ideological training, in training you in basically Nazi ideology. And something similar happened under Stalin in the USSR. You have a certain ideological training that's built into the educational system all the way through. Other ways in which you might do this.
Censorship.
Censorship, absolutely. Take control of the press and be very careful about what can be published, what kinds of arguments people can read and hear. Other ways.
Create a centralized idea.
Good. Create a centralized sort of, you might say, bureaucracy that is in charge of official ideology. Now, in Stalin's case, notice, he really wanted this to be about him. Hitler wasn't quite like that. He was trying to get you to share his worldview, but it wasn't really to be changed arbitrarily so that you feared only Hitler. Hitler really was committed to this ideology in a way that Stalin, I think, wasn't really committed to any particular ideology. For Stalin, all of this was about basically allegiance to Stalin the person himself, the universal genius. Whereas in Hitler's case, it was really about enforcing and defining this kind of ideology. And so that's the kind of thing you can use a ministry of propaganda for, a bureaucracy for, to try to centralize all sorts of things, including education, including decision-making power itself. In fact, that's part of what Hitler did. He dissolved all political parties. He dissolved all trade unions. Dissolved all organizations other than the Nazi Party itself. Try to compete any other alternative voices from being heard. He tried to substitute Nazi ideology even for Christianity. He realized the church was powerful enough, he couldn't really get rid of the church altogether, but he could replace Christ and the cross, for example, with Hitler and a swastika. And that's what he tried to do. He basically tried to take over the church and turn it into a force for Nazi ideology. Now, to its shame, some part of German Christianity actually went along with that. But there was also a great deal of opposition, and lots of pastors and theologians ended up in prison as a result of it. Well, part of this, too, was just centralized control of everything, a process of defederalization. Germany hadn't really been a country for all that long. It was unified in the 19th century. Before that, there were just a lot of small German states, unified more or less by language, by culture, but not unified politically. And it was not until the 19th century and Bismarck, really, that those things coalesced into one nation, Germany. But they still had a kind of federal structure, so that the central government wasn't that powerful. A lot of power still remained in the various parts of Germany, in Bavaria, in Prussia, and so on. And the process of defederalization essentially involved taking power away from all those regions, all those localities, all the cities and towns and so forth, and centralizing it in Berlin under Hitler's direct control. Well, of course, it's not enough to do this in the party in the sense of enforcing one worldview, one political party. In the end, he, like Stalin, wanted power concentrated in one person. And so he said, inevitably, out of the army of millions who feel the truth of these ideas, and even may understand them to some extent, one man must arise, he must formulate principles that will be as clear-cut and as firm as granite. He must fight for these principles as the only true ones until a solid rock of common faith and common will emerges above the troubled waves of vagrant ideas. And so this is, of course, himself. He's saying, yeah, some people out there would see the truth, but look, it's like vagrants, right? You've got this crowd of bums. That's like what the world idea is like. All these ideological hobos hanging around, there's no order to this, but one person will see the true vision, and that one person will teach it to everybody else. And he places himself in the role of that one great leader who will do this. So, yes, in the end, what is the moral view that goes along with this? Well, we've talked about how he's taking Marx's system and basically putting race in place of class. That's part of it. But part of it is, in the end, just what Trotsky had said about Marxist ideology, which is, look, whatever serves the interest of the party is the right thing to do. There is no independent standard of morality. There's just whatever serves the interest of the party, i.e., what serves the interest of Hitler. So the general justification of an action is to be sought in the necessity for it, and the individual will be justified by his success. And the success here, the justification, the necessity, is all necessity in terms of bringing about this single vision, of promoting the interests of the party. There are no moral constraints other than success. And so the question is, does it work? Does it promote the interests of the Nazi party? If so, it's good. There is no other criteria allowed. Now notice, this isn't relativism exactly, because Hitler does think his program promotes a kind of beauty, a kind of dignity. It is relative to success, and so in that way, highly contextual. What works to promote the interest of the party is the right thing, but the party is justified not in terms of itself, but really because of this vision, because of this idealism. It alone really understands things in a way that has this kind of beauty to it. Well, okay, so the state is the all-purpose, the sort of all-consuming thing. Mussolini suggests that, right? Everything inside the state, nothing outside the state, nothing against the state. In Hitler's case, the state is really a means, not an end. But on the other hand, it does have a purpose which is connected to race in the end. It's to promote a community of human beings who are physically as well as spiritually kindred, who see this one vision and share this one racial heritage. And so in the end, that's the sole purpose of government. He says states that aren't like that, they have no justification, they're monstrosities. The fact that they do exist is no more a justification than the successful raids carried out by a band of pirates could be called a justification for pirates. And so you show him a successful country like the United States, and he basically says that's no justification for anything at all. That is merely, well, something like a raid of pirates. It's a monstrosity. It suggests no unified vision. It doesn't have any unity. All right, well, it goes on and on. I'm actually running out of patience to talk about this, and I'm talking about one little glimpse. When this book was first published, nobody really read it. It sort of fell stillborn for the press, in Hume's phrase. But on the other hand, once Hitler actually rose to power, it became an immensely popular work. People would buy it for each other as presents. People would give it to young people. Whether anybody actually read it, I mean, it's very thick. And the prose is painful. Painful. I realize in this course I pursue a high standard. We read people like Auden and Eliot, Dostoevsky, and other great writers. But yeah, this is not enjoyable to read in the slightest, even putting aside the horrible nature of the ideas. Yeah, anyway, I doubt many people got through that many pages of it. But the idea really in the end is to promote the interests of the race. Now, in 1932, he stood for election. He ran to become the president. And he ran on this platform. It's an interesting campaign, in a way. Throughout the history of the Nazi Party, they had not been doing well, until, as we'll see, the Smoot-Hawley tariff, which devastated the German economy. But here was his idea. Politicians had ruined the Reich. What did he mean? Not just German politicians, though that was true in his view, but also the politicians who imposed the Treaty of Versailles in Germany. So it was the international coalition he was really arguing against, as well as the domestic leaders of the Weimar Republic. He thought of the state as essentially a unity. The whole goal was to unify society, unify the state under one banner, in one worldview, like Charlemagne. And so what do? Well, we have to get beyond politics in order to achieve that unity. Now, it's a kind of appeal you might recognize from all sorts of other political campaigns, right? We've got to rise above politics. Some people are saying this, some people are saying that. We've got to rise above these disputes and seek a larger unity. That's something that by itself isn't necessarily fascist or isn't necessarily bad. It's actually, I mean, who are some people who have said that in their political campaigns, or who are saying that? Getting beyond politics, getting beyond these divisions of right and left, seeking some unity. Well, yeah, that was actually the basis of the Obama campaign in 2008. Where else do you see that sort of thing? All right, good. A variety of people now actually saying things like this. And what it really means, in other words, is this is the classic outsider view. I'm not calling any of those people fascists. Let me make it clear. I'm basically saying this was a kind of outsider's campaign. What he was doing is taking the campaign themes that people who are arguing, look, yeah, all these troubles are in Washington, or in Berlin, or, in London, or wherever it is. I'm an outsider. I can bring a new approach. I can unify us. I can get above these divisions that everybody else is caught up in. And so this was a classic outsider political campaign, really saying, look, there are all these divisions, all these disputes, all this disharmony, disunity. I'm an outsider. I can bring a new perspective. I can bring us all together. And so it is something that, I think we can look at this from a historical perspective and say, how did he end up actually winning? How did this happen? How did a highly civilized, highly educated country end up electing somebody like Hitler? It was partly because of that outsider appeal. People thought, yes, the country is a mess. Yes, our leaders have done a very bad job. Internationally speaking, yeah, we feel like we got screwed by the leaders of these other countries. And so this outsider appeal was really very powerful. Now, beyond that, of course, it was very vague. The idea was, well, yes, we should have the party of a great heroic nation. And so it was kind of vague what was exactly going to happen or how he was going to do this. He didn't really lay out detailed programs. It was much more this general sort of appeal of the outsider. In addition, well, yeah, he viewed himself as an artist. And he ran a campaign of, we should have a government of artists. Plato in the Republic says, philosophers should be kings, right? The ideal leader would be the philosopher. Now, with the exception of me, I can't think of many other philosophers I'd be willing to trust with such power. That's a joke. But in this case, it was really saying, look, here's what's been wrong. Politicians are all concerned with self-interest, their own self-interest, the self-interest of some faction. They should instead be thinking about the good of society at large, and they should be seeking a larger vision, something that really is tied to beauty. They should be artists. And his own campaign events were something like this. He borrowed the main ideas from Wagner's opera, this idea of opera as music and theater and dance and just a beautiful artistic performance of many dimensions. That's what a Hitler rally was like. And so the idea was, government will be like that. It will be like this grand, beautiful artistic production that brings out the beauty and greatness of the German people. And in the process, we will bring people onto the same page. We will align them. We will bring about this unity. We will socialize the people and get them all to commit to the greater good. And so it all sounded quite good. Now, of course, he ran on a socialist platform, but he downplayed all of that. He really admitted that his intention was to leave industry alone. He said, do you think I should be so mad as to destroy really what was left of, at that point, Germany's economy? Yes. Hitler's story, we've talked a little bit about his political program and about his ideology. I want to say something about the actual course of his taking power in Germany, and then what he did throughout the 1930s. He was released from prison in December of 1924, just over a year after the Munich beer hall putsch. He aligned himself with Gregor Strasser and Joseph Goebbels in 1925, and so was already beginning to ingratiate himself into the National Socialist Workers' Party. He took control of that party in 1926. Now, it was a party whose platform we already talked about. It was committed to a socialist working class revolution, but it was also anti-Jewish and it was anti-communist as well as anti-Weimar. So it was anti a lot of things. It basically had a program that at first glance might look a lot like a Marxist program, and yet it was sharply anti-Marxist and anti-communist. It was an anti-Weimar Republic. It saw that as a weak government imposed by Allied powers, and so not reflecting the true nature of Germany. And it was also strongly anti-Jewish. There was the sense that the Jewish presence in Germany was something foreign that had to be eradicated, that Hitler played on, but it was already there in the party even before he took it over. He advocated, and the party advocated, a third way. The idea was communism represented one sort of extreme, capitalism represented another, and the search was for something in between, something that was not communist, but also not capitalist, not based on free enterprise, something that was a path in between, a third way, which is one of the meanings of Hitler's term Third Reich. Now, at first, this party really did not have much appeal. In the early 1920s, as we've seen, there was an extreme hyperinflation in Germany, destroyed many aspects of the German economy, destroyed the German middle class, but it also wiped out war debts. That was the advantage of printing all that money in the first place. Then, once the Dawes Plan took over and enabled a sort of stable economy, once the Weimar Republic had replaced the currency with a new currency that was stable, there was a kind of prosperity. It never really quite got back up to pre-war levels. So Germany in the mid to late 1920s was better off than it had been since 1914, but still really not quite back up to 1914 levels. So things were better, but not themselves great. In 1928, given these generally positive economic conditions, the Nazis got less than 3% of the vote. The appeal of the party was very limited. But all of that changed dramatically when the Great Depression struck. The Smoot-Hawley tariff, which had a devastating effect on international trade in general, had a huge impact on Germany. Germany had one way, once it had stopped trying to print its way out of war debts, of actually making the economy run, being able to pay its debts, but also being able to generate growth in the domestic economy, and that was through international trade. So this was something that hit Germany especially hard. Unemployment soared to 34% almost in 1931, just a year after that was enacted. A year later, it was almost 44%. Now, I want you to think about what an unemployment rate of 44% would be like. Almost half of all workers would be unemployed. The worst of the Great Depression in the United States saw us hit an unemployment rate of about 25%. In recent recessions, say in 2008, 2009, we're going back to the one after the dot-com bubble burst and the September 11th attacks, or going back to the early 90s, or then the 1987 recession, and so forth and so on. Really, the worst that the US economy has gotten within our lifetimes was something like 9%. Now, 9%, there have been some changes in the way it's calculated. Some people have argued that really that 9% as measured contemporaneously was really equivalent to maybe an unemployment rate, the old way of computing it of maybe 12%. But still, we're talking about the Great Depression being twice as much, at least, as any of us have ever seen in our lifetimes, even me, and I'm old. And then Germany's being almost twice that. So really, half of all adults seeking employment or out of work, that's an astounding and devastating fact. It was in the context of that Hitler's movement began to have real power. A lot of times people will align the hyperinflation and the rise of Hitler as if those went hand in hand. But actually that's not true. They were separated by almost a decade. And Germany had recovered pretty well from that hyperinflation until the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act ended up having devastating effects on international trade in general. Now, the Nazi movement went from virtually nowhere, having 3% support, to suddenly having very significant support. Who were the chief supporters? Who do you think would be backing a movement like this? The unemployed, that's one obvious answer. People who were thrown out of work, people who were now desperate for radical change or were willing to listen to a message they hadn't heard before. Who else? Well, it's embarrassing. Here's a group of early Nazi supporters. Who do they look like? Actually, it's a pretty pretty mixed group. I don't know what they look like. However, it was really largely a student movement. Students and professors, in addition to the unemployed, in addition to those who were really displaced in the economic disruptions, were the main advocates of Nazi policies, the main advocates of the party. It was primarily a student movement. In fact, student movements were really largely Nazi already by 1930. So even before the Smoot-Hawley tariff, there were strong Nazi student movements at the German universities. Many professors were Nazis. In fact, a very famous philosopher from the period, Martin Heidegger, was a Nazi. And to his credit, he resigned after about a year of serving as rector of a German university as someone affiliated with the Nazi party. But on the other hand, not to his credit, he never apologized for his affiliation with the party. And he was one of many German academics who actually signed on to Hitler's program. Now, of course, a student movement, even one to which many professors were sympathetic, was not really going to go anywhere independently of the economic disruption that had that message resonate with lots of people outside the universities who were unemployed. He made a very wise, in a way, partnership with an industrialist, Alfred Hugenberg, which enabled him to actually have the money to publicize the platform of the party. In 1930, they got 18% of the vote, but that was before the Smoot-Hawley tariff fully kicked in. By 1932, when there was almost 44% unemployment, they got 37% of the vote. And so the party had gone from 3% support to 37% support in a relatively short period of time. And in fact, in that election in 1932, the Nazis and the communists together had more than half the vote, and so had more than half the representation in the Reichstag. Despite all of this, Hindenburg, who was the German chancellor, what would he be called? the sort of, Germany at this point had a weird combination of a sort of representative republic and a traditional quasi-monarchy. Hindenburg fulfilled the role of the Kaiser in that, and so it was not quite honorary like the British king and queen, but nevertheless, it was somebody who didn't have full powers. It was somebody who, was still functioning largely to the extent that he not only exerted a kind of moral force, but also got to appoint the chancellor. Well, in this situation, the normal course of action would be to take the leader of the ruling coalition, in this case Hitler, and appoint him chancellor. Hindenburg would not do it. However, he changed his tune a few months later. Now, why did this movement have an appeal, initially in the universities, but then more broadly once the economy started falling apart? Part of it was the aftermath of World War I. We've talked about the Treaty of Versailles and the resentment in Germany for what were perceived as injustices resulting from the treaty's terms. And so it was to some extent the fact that Germany felt humiliated just by the outcome of the war, by having to enter into an armistice, by losing, as it were. A second thing was the sense of injustice of the peace terms. But then also there was the rewriting of the map. There was a sense in which Germany felt cheated by what happened at the end of the war. Woodrow Wilson and the other Allied leaders believed in a principle of self-determination, said people should have the right to have their own nation, their own government. Now, what does it mean to be a people in this sense? Well, there were a variety of things. There was a question of how people self-identified, it had to do with language. There was a sense that large empires, like the Ottoman Empire, or like the Austro-Hungarian Empire, consisting of many different nationalities, many different languages, and so forth, were really untenable. That each group within those should have the ability to control their own destiny. For example, what was it that actually started the war? It was a Serbian activist, a member of the Black Hand, assassinating the Austrian. And so the thought was, if these various ethnic and linguistic groups had their own countries, then they would be able to determine their own destinies, and that this was what was to be sought. That led to the breakup of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, led to the breakup of the Ottoman Empire, an attempt to rewrite things more or less, and only more or less, along these ethnic, religious, linguistic grounds. But now Germany looked at that and said, well, wait a minute, all sorts of German-speaking peoples who identify themselves as Germans, are now outside the bounds of Germany. And so there was a sense that even on that principle, what had happened was unjust. It wasn't just that German territory had been taken, German territory in which Germans, people speaking German, people thinking of themselves as German, were outside Germany And so Hitler and the Nazi Party were able to play on perceived resentment. We lost the war, that was a humiliation. The peace terms were unfair, and then specifically they spouted this idea of self-determination, but then cheated Germany out of what was properly its under that very principle. Another reason was that the Nazis fomented a great deal of street violence. They wanted violence on the streets. They wanted people to be afraid of crime. Why? Well, they were interested in fomenting political divisions. Remember, Hitler ran as something of an outsider, and so the thought was, show people the ordinary political process is broken. They already believe the economy is broken. Show them that the political process is broken too. Heighten political divisions. Make it look like various parties are fighting each other, not only rhetorically, but physically in the streets. So here you see a photograph of a Nazi, actually, a young Nazi who was involved in an episode of street violence and had been hit in the head with a bottle. And that kind of street violence, people attacked in the streets, violent fights among various groups, were part of what, to some extent, is driving people to think the Nazis had. Look, we need somebody in order to clean up this, in order to bring order back to society. To some extent, this was being fomented by the Nazis themselves to produce precisely that reaction. Well, on August 10th, Hitler sent his men into the streets. They beat a communist to death in front of his own command. Now, you would think that would be devastating to someone's political career. Wait, you're behind these thugs who beat this protester to death in front of his own family? But Hitler didn't back away from it. He didn't apologize for it. In fact, he published a defense of the murder. The result of that was that the Nazis went down a little bit from 37 to 33%. But still, they commanded 33% of the vote. The communists took 100 seats, so about half that, and again, the two of them together actually had enough power to command a majority. Now, why would the Nazis and the communists, as it were, group together and form a coalition? It is one of the mysteries of this, that they actually ended up doing this and convincing Hindenburg to appoint Hitler chancellor on January 30th, 1933. So 2 successive elections, the Nazis and the communists together were able to put together a sort of majority. Now, why would a communist go along with this? Why would a socialist in general go along with Hitler's coalition? I'm really asking you. Imagine you're a socialist, maybe even a communist, elected to the Reichstag, and Hitler comes and says, form a coalition with me, we can be a majority. Why would you say yes?
So you can get more of a say.
So you can get more of a say, exactly. For one thing, this is the National German Socialist Workers' Party. It would have looked to you as if the big issue is, are we seeking international socialism or national socialism? And so you would have thought, that's a sort of minor issue. I mean, ultimately a very important one, but nevertheless, especially with respect to domestic politics, you might think there's a huge overlap of interest. And if I'm part of the ruling coalition, then actually this will give me greater say. I won't be the minority party opposing these things. Instead, I will be part of the majority. And I think the socialists also thought, well, look, Hitler's a useful way of gaining power, especially the communist thought it. They thought, yes, he says he's anti-communist, but look, he's already part of the way there. And moreover, if look, is this guy really going to rule Germany for any length of time? Impossible. He will be our ticket to power. We will become part of the ruling coalition, and then we can push it aside. That's what the communists thought. That's what the other socialists thought. They thought, look, we'll play along, we'll have a better rule, we'll be part of the ruling majority, and look, we can get him out of the way. Who's he? He's some corporal from the First World War who somehow has this political power. He's a nobody from the outside. We can outsmart him, we can push him aside. And so here Hitler is shaking hands with Hindenburg, becoming chancellor. And here are the crowds outside. There is a huge march to celebrate the Nazi victory after that. And there is Hitler in the window. It's lit up, you can see, about to address the crowd. Well, there were other marches. Here is one. In fact, there's a movie, Triumph of the Will, that shows some of these actual marches. And here is a scene from that. They were really dramatic productions. Thousands and thousands of people gathered, huge columns erected, a big platform. These were immense theatrical productions. And here were some of the posters from these 1932 elections to try to give you an idea of what was going on. the National Socialist poster there on the left, one specifically talking about Adolf Hitler and how good he would be for women. And then on the right, again, showing the eagle as something like, a symbol of a powerful Germany. The results of the elections are reported here. The Nazi Party took the red zones. The Greens went for parties that were more to the right. And so you can see western parts of Germany were actually not very pro-Nazi. It was primarily the central and eastern parts that voted for the Nazi Party. Here is Hitler listening to the radio of the results, finding out that his party has done well. There was a 25,000-man torchlight parade celebrating Hitler's victory, and it was so dramatic, and Hitler made his intention so clear that Hindenburg actually dissolved the Reichstag, in effect the German Congress, told everybody to go home. He was worried about violence and about a physical takeover of the Reichstag. Well, in February, so just a few weeks after seizing power, the Reichstag caught on fire. Hitler blamed the communists. Now, actually, it's much disputed what really happened here. A lot of people think that Hitler himself had the fire set and blamed it on the communists. It could be that there were some communist protesters who did this, but in any case, Hitler used the event to try to cast the blame on the Communist Party and push them out of the ruling coalition. The communists had expected it to go the other way. Well, not only did he manage to push the communists aside through this method, rights under the Constitution, the Weimar Constitution, were suspended. In March 1933, so only a few months after this first election, Hitler called for additional elections, and then he won 44% of the vote. So it was at this point that he was able, with a few other minor parties, to actually command control, and he got the Reichstag to pass something called the Enabling Act. The Enabling Act is a remarkable bit of political suicide. What did it say? It vested all legislative power in Hitler and his cabinet. So what it meant is basically the equivalent of Congress saying, Mr. President, you and your cabinet can have the power of creating laws. We won't do anything to stop you. In short, it was taking a system where there was an independent legislature, an independent judiciary, and then an executive branch, and having the legislature vote to give away all its power and give it to the executive branch. Now, how did that happen? Why, as a German legislator, would you actually vote to give Hitler and his cabinet all power? Why would you, in effect, put yourself out of business and say, making laws, we're tired of that, you just do it? Yeah.
Fear, just like the patriot.
Oh, fear. Okay, there might be lots of reasons why people do this kind of thing, why they cede power. And usually, you're absolutely right, it comes down to fear. Okay? It comes down to fear of what exactly? Well, it might be fear of a foreign power. It might be fear of angry crowds. It might be fear of demonstration. It might be fear of, persecution. It could be fear of political fallout. There are many things that frighten people. Some of them are actually physical threats. Some of them are of a different nature. They're afraid that the people want this, and they better not be seen as standing in the way or they'll lose their seats, and so on. There can be many motivations. And Hitler was very good at using propaganda. He was very good at using physical violence. He was able to appeal to whatever it took in a given person's case to actually get them to support this sort of thing. Now, one reason for the appeal of it, you might say, is for a legislator who suddenly senses there's huge change afoot. The people are restless. There are these torchlight parades, huge demonstrations. There are extreme groups carrying out fighting in the streets. I'm in physical danger. I'm also in very political danger. This gets me off the hook. And so never underestimate the power of cowardice. Not only giving into fear in the sort of direct way, but thinking, I don't want the responsibility. Okay, here's a time of great change. People are angry. It is dangerous to take responsibility for political changes. Here's one way of avoiding it. Give all the power to Hitler and his cabinet and let it be their power. Now I'm off the hook. Well, of course, the moment this happened, Hitler had no further need of the Reichstag. He had no further need of these other parties he was in coalition with. In particular, he said to the socialist parties, who had united with him to form a majority at this point, now I have no further need of you. So here he could really govern Germany unilaterally without need for any legislative approval.